Hello, Lev. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast. Really excited to start some discussions with you and thought we might start with a little bit of your background.
Well, thanks first, Mark. Thanks for having me. And I want to say that we're chatting the day after uh, a very important event. We were all gripping watching the World Series last night, and I wanted to say the Blue Jays did all Canadians proud, which, by way of background, includes me. So, by way of background, I'm actually in my day job. I am Arizona State University's Chief Information Officer. I was actually born in the States to Canadian parents, grew up in Canada. I was on faculty at Wilfrid Laurier. I got my PhD at York University. I took a sabbatical in 93. Found myself actually at Arizona State University in 1993 for my sabbatical, and always kept an eye on this fabulous institution. And after spending 17 years in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve University, I jumped at the opportunity to come back to Arizona State University eight years ago now, and I'm the enterprise CIO here.
That's really interesting. I know in my travels, globally and across Canada, lots of discussions, but ASU really stands out. Some amazing transformation over the last number of years. I think really incredible leadership, and you're part of the leadership team. So I'm really excited to dig into that. And I know what's on everybody's mind right now is kind of how maybe ASU and your experience around implementing AI and how you're thinking about AI. But I would like to actually go even broader because I know AI is impacting almost every technology, and there are many other really important technologies to be discussing and bringing into the conversation, even though we may spend more of our time specifically on AI, but things like digital twinning and other technologies that I know you're really thinking of. And it's really a convergence of many technologies and how that is transforming, service delivery for post-secondary institutions, but also we're seeing here sector councils, any intermediaries that support businesses, other training institutions, and not-for-profits and communities. So it's a time when everybody from the Prime Minister of Canada to the high school student is really thinking about the future and asking questions. So I'm really excited to dig into that. I might maybe start with the question, like, if you were 18 again today, how would you be thinking? So you have the wisdom of with all of the experience you have, but you're in an 18-year-old body again and starting your career. How would you be thinking about that?
Well, certainly, I think the last 40 or 50 years, if you want to put me into the 18-year-old skin again, uh, it was a fascinating time. It grew up obviously at the tail end of the boom post Second World War, a expansive, interconnected world, driven mostly through a global trade regime, a series of aggregated regional economic efforts, place where opportunity, mobility, were certainly part of the sort of world view at the time, and obviously as we are living through a moment of transition, we can certainly look backwards and see just how enormously um, lucky and privileged we were to grow up in that period of time, growing up in Canada especially. I do think that, 40 to 50 years ago, it turns out that there was a whole bunch of emergent technologies that were coming up. Again, whether it was the early development of the protocols that ended up being known as the internet, which is certainly now 50 years in the making, and certainly had a very interesting historical origin story, which had to do with how to actually design a telecommunications infrastructure that would survive a nuclear war coming out of the US military establishment and DARPA, the defense planning environment, trying to design, How would we survive if there was no central control, where the White House somehow was taken offline? And what came up was these protocols called TCP/IP. In long ago, when I was about 18, and it turns out that those were very important DNA for everything that we know right now. And again, shortly, along that journey from the original origins of the internet, we also got early insights through, for example, in the December of 1968. We had a spectacular demonstration called the Mother of All Demos by Doug Engelbart, which gave us an insight not only on the internet, but also things like uh, what the web would look like, what a mouse would look like, what would collaboration look like. The first video collaboration over the nascent internet, which of course we're doing today, was done back in 1968. Collaboration tools, all demonstrated by Doug in that amazing Mother of All Demos event. And so I grew up in that moment in time, and as I've sort of now fast forward all these years, I actually think that 18-year-olds today are actually approaching an even more important technological moment. Again, the context, the socioeconomic context is very different than that moment in the sort of growth era of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the technological developments that we now associate with AI, again, let me just sort of, for you and for everyone who's listening, it's an overnight disruption, 70 years in the making. So again, like every technology, it has a nascent part. There was a seminar that was pulled together at Dartmouth, a college here in the United States, in which those original ideas of what today we call AI came forward. But we are at that moment where an 18-year-old it can look forward to a set of very, very disruptive, potentially enormously value add, potentially very significant negative impact on a lot of the things that we take for granted today. So it is a moment of enormous transition and change. And I think, as I did growing up, I saw this as just an enormous opportunity to be engaged, involved, and help shaping it, not simply to essentially wait to buy it. And again, I think today, as whether we're talking about individual consumer experiences, corporate experiences, workforce development experiences, provincial or national policy approaches, we would do well to understand that as the history of technology is written, those organizations, institutions, legislatures, and parliaments and think tanks that jumped in early to help shape that future are actually the ones who actually overwhelmingly have been able to take advantage. Advantage is either in wealth creation or new job formation or new opportunities to pivot economies, throughout human history. I mean, those are really, really important, and no more exciting time. The tectonic plates of the technological underpinning of our global, again, continental, national, and regional economies is all evolving today, right now. AI is not the future. It's here, and it's simply unevenly distributed right now.
Yeah, I would, again, completely agree. I think what we're seeing in a lot of discussions is also there's kind of a people's intuition around how fast that is changing and what it will impact is not necessarily, I guess, aligned. I'm interested in kind of your perception of that. Things
Mm-hmm.
are changing so rapidly. I often speak, my father passed away a couple of years ago. He was 93, and just thinking of talking all the discussions with him. He grew up in a rural part of Nova Scotia and was 17 when they got electricity, right? So and that's within kind of our understanding growing up, talking to our parents, etc. But the amount of change that's happened is incredible. But again, it's accelerating. It's been accelerating consistently, but we're getting kind of at an inflection point where I find that a lot of people are not really, like, the intuition of how fast it's changing is I would argue, at least, misaligned. So we tend to underestimate the impact of technology in the long term. So one of the things I actually pose a question to people, are we over or under hyping AI right now?
Yes and yes. Just to use your framing, because this is exactly the condition that we're living in. All the oxygen in the room among technology leaders is being sucked out to be talking about AI, and that overhyping to build the biggest, fastest, AI engine is in and of itself, and not a particularly exciting vision for me as an educator, but it is being driven by a sort of a technological imperative that has global finance frothing at the opportunity. And so much so that, the cost of not getting in is what's driving every investor, whether that's in Asia, the Middle East, the US, Canada, to figure that this is not the moment to wait for it to all get sort of sorted out. However, the truth is that, again, I describe this as tectonic plates intentionally, because this is a shift that is actually of that magnitude and order. Most times, although you can oftentimes detect tremors before the tectonic plates begin to shift, we would do well to understand that this will be a 50 to 100-year transformation that is happening. And I think, just like your dad growing up in Nova Scotia, Mark, in this country, when electrification became a thing, what companies needed to do and policymakers in state assemblies did is they actually set up test kitchens to actually show housewives what electrification could mean to transform their lives in their sort of domestic setting. And as a result, not only in the domestic setting, then all the upstream and downstream economic opportunities for electrification, as it was a completely new way of thinking about the moment in time. And we're now 100 years past that moment in time, but the idea of finding ways of engaging people where they live on the issues that matter to them, whether that's sort of the nitty gritty of how's my job changing, or how's my consumer experience changing, or how's my community going to be impacted. We should, and we are talking about it, but we also have to create experiences that allow people to begin to experience the opportunities, as well as to understand, what trade-offs there are going to inevitably be. I think that should shape kind of what we do locally. I also think it's the kind of thing that labs should be set up, test bed labs, if you will, to actually support everything from transformation of work to opportunities for new kinds of disruptive technologies, whether that's in healthcare and healthcare discovery or healthcare delivery, whether that's in education development, or again, the change in the workplace in terms of what collaboration means along the way. We can wait to be sold things that sort of shake out in the marketplace, and we should also be jumping in to help shape those opportunities in ways that, again, I think are just an enormously exciting opportunity right now, as we think about this as an enormous opportunity to design our futures, again, whether that's local, community, regionally, provincially, nationally, or globally. A whole new regime will evolve, and I think we should see this as an opportunity to help shape the things that matter to us in the context that matter to us.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important point. And as we go forward in this series, I think we'll talk about maybe some specific or concrete innovation projects or ways to pilot and test that. And I think it's at every level. One of the things I get a little bit concerned about is people thinking like AI is like a new sector or a new industry. And most of the, for example, government effort going into AI startups and scale ups and infrastructure, which is incredibly important. I'm not diminishing that in any way. But where I spend a lot of time thinking about is, I think what you're indicating is the need for all parts of our society to help build and shape it. So whether it's the students thinking about their new career, the community organization that serves people in its community, the school or the post-secondary institution, I think really starting that piloting or lab kind of focus is incredibly important. Having the right, for lack of a better term, infrastructure sandbox to do that becomes really, really important. Can you give me a few of your thoughts on how we might be able to do that? And I think for me, Canada's not going to compete in the um, building the massive data centers and the large language model space, but we can compete in trust and adoption. And so I think for all in society to make sure that we're bringing all members of society along. So in thinking about that, what would you be focusing on right now if
Mm.
you're the government, if you're a leader of a community organization, or if you're, a post-secondary president? What would you be thinking about?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying I might take issue with the opportunity in Canada to play in the sort of core infrastructure piece of it. I mean, I don't know enough just yet, but what we know here in Arizona, of all places, is there is again this sort of emergent, new, let's call it sort of technical stack for the future of the economy. It's a combination of and uh, data centers, semiconductors, and AI. And our approach here in Arizona is to become the center of this 21st century tech stack. And I think, for what it's worth, Canada probably at a national level has most of the requisite infrastructure as a resource rich, resource dependent economy, essentially forever, to leverage hydropower, to leverage national policies that should continue to evolve towards broadband availability, rights of way, things of that sort. Data centers require three things: power, cooling, and oftentimes with that comes water. Canada has an abundance of it. It doesn't mean that Canada, just because it can, should get into that piece of action. But I do say that, again, and we can talk about this in future conversations, that there is an enormous opportunity here to perhaps evolve policies where it makes sense to support infrastructure tied not just to national purposes, but continental purposes to support the sort of again, this new tech stack along the way. And again, using national policies to support a semiconductor strategy for Canada, hugely important
Mm-hmm.
to be playing in that space and not ceding that to Asia, to Europe, and to the US alone, because it will be a strategic asset. Those economies that manage to get all of the stack together, I think, will be global winners. If organizations and policymakers decide to wait it out and cede all of that, or even some of this to others, I think that there will be significant consequences for an economy that is, in Canada's case, so resource dependent, not seeing the opportunities to actually leverage additional value in the economic downstream opportunities by leveraging, some of those key resource opportunities that are in play. But that's not all. I guess I would say this can't be just an infrastructure play, but I do think that this is enormously important. I do think that given the size of Canada and the strength of the post-secondary education sector, there is an enormous opportunity because it is large enough on a global scale to be a model, small enough in terms of numbers of post-secondary institutions to actually do some orchestrated work together. So Canada has done this better than most around high performance computing, for example, as a
Mm-hmm.
sort of early example of not overbuilding in the sense of every province or every university having to have a high performance or an advanced AI infrastructure, but really orchestrating and coordinating it and doing it sector specific. So that if there's a resource AI play, that that's thought through, and if there's a healthcare AI play, and if there is a workforce AI play, yes, everybody wants to take advantage of it, but not everyone needs to invest in either the infrastructure or in the software. Again, you spoke about LLMs. There are these general purpose frontier models of LLMs, but in the next, again, the future is already here, just unevenly distributed. We're already seeing all these discrete sector specific language models that allow us to tune our machine language, our machine learning models that are there, and those should be absolutely optimized for the sectors that we're interested in. And the global stuff is important, but not necessary, but insufficient for a national policy. You have to leverage all of the opportunities at the national scale and ultimately all the way down to the local scale to be able to have impact. Just sort of like one small example. One of the things that we're doing here in Arizona, again, like a lot of Canada, we have very large indigenous communities here. We have 12 tribes here. About a third of the land in Arizona belongs to the tribal nations here. And so we've had lots of conversations about how those communities would like to think about participating in the design and the development of some of these early labs for AI. And they've got all kinds of reasons to be, and they're very articulate, skeptical of their culture and their traditions being usurped yet again by folks without much interest in their well-being long term. And so we've developed, and I think there's a whole new opportunity, and not just for tribal communities, on offline AI experiences, which allow those communities to leverage AI to help educate and train their communities in the use of AI, but essentially have them actually designed and supporting an offline experience by permission only, offline, protecting, supporting, and even developing local vernacular languages to support their continued growth along the way. And that's kind of one example of a way to tweak the experience beyond the idea that this is a race to create an AGI, which all-knowing AI, which is its own narrative. But the opportunity here is to, again, to shape at this local level and to figure out again nationally, how to support that. So again, we're not only talking about it here in Arizona. There is actually an international and now an emerging global conversation among tribal communities and nations around the world, because this is a model that works. In Canadian leadership here has been enormously important to our thinking about it, because not surprisingly, some of the best thought leadership in this particular use case of how to design a future that respects, promotes, and yet, if those communities choose to, allows them to participate in this community based on maintaining their commitments to oral traditions, as well as to the importance of their indigenous knowledge that again they can certainly protect and choose to share as they see fit.
Yeah, so wow, a lot of really interesting threads to pick up on there, and I think we're going to touch on some of them in future episodes. But I think just to clarify, I think the way I've been thinking is it's unlikely that we would have a company, Cohere is a very advanced company that we can be very proud of as Canadians, as one of the leading kind of large language models. But it's exactly what you were talking about, the race for AGI and the capital requirements for that I'm not sure it's a game that Canada should be trying to play in, but where I do think we have the resource base and many other pieces that could make Canada a powerhouse in actually the adoption of AI, again, for all. And I'm particularly, actually, I've met with a lot of Indigenous leaders in Canada recently, and we just had a big event in Manitoba and had a chance to talk to a lot of different groups there as well. The Diversity Institute, interestingly enough, a research center at TMU, did a recent report and found that actually Indigenous peoples and also others, marginalized groups, were more likely to be willing to adopt AI. So it's some really interesting insights coming out there. I think people or groups that may have been kept out of the economy before are starting to see this as an opportunity, to your point. And so I think that's a really, really exciting area. Most Canadians don't know, for Indigenous youth growing up in Northwestern Ontario, for example, or Northern Ontario, rural, remote communities, have to leave home in grade 7 to continue education in high school. So there are whole new models of how people could stay in their community, we could scale education, that are really exciting. I think we will absolutely dive into that in coming
Yeah.
episodes. Very, very interesting. And I think there's opportunity to learn and collaborate potentially with I know ASU, and you're working with a number of, as you mentioned, groups in in Arizona, but I think there's also some leadership starting to emerge here in Canada around that. And so, yeah, very, very exciting how education, I think, can be democratized, but it certainly will change models of the current institutions and ways. And so that's another area that I really want to
Yes,
dive into in the future.
to be clear, right? This is, the design project here is not tabula rasa. Like, it's not like we have a clean piece of paper. We have inherited institutions and organizational models and interests. And what we have to have here, hopefully, is open, transparent conversations in which we can align on aspirations and goals, situate, the opportunities in the context of where, our organizations, regions, countries are, leverage, especially as it relates to education and workforce, the pieces that I am enormously consumed with at the moment, because I do believe that while the first internet revolution, of which we spoke at the top of our conversation today, Mark, took 30 years to evolve, and now we realize that the internet indeed did change everything. This new AI, and I believe it to be a revolution, will not take anywhere near that amount of time. And so, I believe that buckling up is one thing to do, but the other thing to do is to actually have intentional, meaningful conversations that lead to orchestrations that lead to demonstrations and labs about the art of the possible. Build not only for our current sectors as we understand them, but understand that those sectors are going to absolutely, without a doubt, well, we could say face challenges, but let's just cut to the chase. They're going to change. And so, how we design for that is informed by our mindset. We can have a mindset of scarcity, a mindset of effectively saying, we're going to wait for everything to settle, or we could have a mindset which is around abundance and growth. And again, this is sort of both a personal, and I get to work at a university that fully subscribes, and in fact, I think is a model for understanding that this is all about navigating, through the eye of the needle of the storm that we're in, to see the opportunity to achieve, again, mission goals. In our case, education, a workforce that is prepared not only to compete but to win in this AI economy, to prepare our students to be not only AI literate, but actually learn the tools, against the methods of how to actually participate in the AI economy, and to help shape, state policy here, a state which is growing but very diverse, on a border facing all kinds of environmental and climate challenges. Add all that and amplify that, and that's certainly looks to me like a lot of the Canadian experience.
Well, I think this is another area that we're going to dive in future episodes, specifically on post-secondary. I think there's, and I know you're aware, I actually saw your keynote at a session in Calgary, I believe earlier this year, speaking to post-secondary institutions. But there's a bit of a perfect storm right now in Canadian education, fiscal situations, change in policy around international students, which were bringing in a lot of revenue. And so it's certainly a time that's very challenging for post-secondary leaders, and easy to be distracted. So I think going to be really, really interested in that kind of positive view. So we had a national pollster, David Cleto, that actually talked about how Canada generally has slipped into what he defined as a precarity mindset. And so I think one of the pieces that is really important is I think mindset, as you mentioned, is going to be absolutely critical moving forward. And questions of how we rebuild that in our institutions, in our education system, in our community organizations will be critical. A growth mindset, but also, I believe, an entrepreneurial mindset, because I personally feel the narrative that most people are seized with, will AI create more net new jobs or will it destroy more jobs than it creates, is a distraction. I think the biggest question we should be focusing on is how will we help people see the opportunity that is already emerging, right? There is so much, you mentioned earlier, technological overhang already that there's so much opportunity, but people are expecting the opportunity to be in the traditional kind of pathways, and that's not I think, where it will be. And so, how do we help people see? How do our educational institutions teach people to be adaptive? I've talked a lot about recently what I've termed adaptive human potential, because I was on an event recently where I was asked, what's the one digital skill that people should learn to future proof themselves? And obviously, there is none, but it's more being adaptive, being able to sense what's happening, realign your skills, fill in the gaps. And
Can I
Yeah,
offer you one skill? Can I offer you one skill
would
that's
love
worth
it. Yeah,
thinking?
would love to.
It's an ancient skill, but now in the AI era, it turns out that it, I believe, is essentially the central skill for which education should be extremely well positioned, and that's to know how to ask questions.
Absolutely.
That is the central opportunity to shift the education, the North Star of education. It's not to fill heads with knowledge. It's not even to somehow to think that we can synthesize knowledge. The machines are likely to be better at all of that. But what we have an opportunity to educate folks on, which will guide them extremely well, whether it's in an entrepreneurial or in a vocational or in a community-based or again, a sort of policy environment, is to understand the opportunity to not only ask questions, but to understand the sequencing and the embedding and the iterations of questions in which we have a relationship, obviously, with one another as we engage in that discourse, but also our exchanges with the co-intelligence with the machines. And our co-intelligence is all, I mean, we call it in nerd speak, prompt engineering. It's actually a misnomer. It's an ancient skill set, which is to know how to question.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So, I sense another episode. So, Lev, I really appreciate your time for today, and look forward to future conversations, and digging into some of the areas that we've kind of skimmed across the top of the waves on today. But super excited, and really thank you for giving your time back to share your experience with the Canadian system. But also, I think our conversations probably will be listened to outside of Canada as well. So sharing your knowledge with those that are interested in how we support our communities, our learners, and our businesses moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark.